Hey guys, so today we're going to go through the uh, workflow, right? Your data flow of how things happen, what the progression is, how I would add a new endpoint to the server, how would I add that new API route into all of the different pieces, and have how do you work on the server in effect. This is going to be very useful as you get into the final step of the backend Red Sky process here for your onboarding. In that process, I'll explain that in a later video, but you will do all of these same steps just for a little bit different, different piece of things that work in continuity with what we're doing here with the user specifically. So, all right, to start off, the first thing I would ask myself is like, what do I do? How do I add an API endpoint, right? We saw from previous videos in the API files where the routes actually live, but how would I go about adding something? What is the process? What does that look like the Red Sky way? So I'll show you the way that I go through things. And yeah, it'll be a good working example of how to add an API route and in a super simple form, and we can go from there. So to start us off with this, a lot of people, the first thing you'll think of is, oh sweet, I need to jump in and I need to just add, I need to do my database query, I need to add my business logic, I need to add an API route, which isn't necessarily the case. The first thing you want to do is we want to go into our types, go into our API, and we want to add some of the or the interface. This is how the front end or any other system is going to talk to our API. So in this case, we want to export an interface, and what we're going to do is imagine that on the application, a user needs to manage their profile. What we need to do is provide them a way to get their user details aside from the auth, right? Maybe something changed in the interim, and when they load that page, they need to request their user object, their latest user object. Whether or not that comes from cache or that comes from the database, whatever, right? We're going to do it from the database. We don't have a caching layer in here yet. Whether or not that's the client or the server, we don't have a caching mechanism. So all of the requests are straight to the database, which is fine for now. So we're going to add a get. And how do I want to get my user? If I make a request from the API, I usually know a few pieces of detail, but we want to use IDs as much as possible, our internal database IDs. So in this case, I would just say ID, it's of type number. That's the only thing I need to ask about. And then my response here, I'm going to have my interface, and we can either get the entirety of the object, we can get a subset of the object. It's really up to us. In this case, let's just get a little bit of a subset of what our user is going to be. So we would get, and then we're going to extend from our model user, right? What the model user is that exact representation of our database that we did, again, previously. So we're going to extend the model user, but I do want to omit some stuff. I don't necessarily want all of this back because I don't need all of this back. I just want their details. So let's omit the token. We'll omit token, permission login, and password. We don't need those fields. Those don't matter. So we'll omit those. And then I give it my object body, and there we go. We have our get and our matching get. And you can see that we try to match the request with the response in our API interfaces. Just so it's readable, the front end can understand what's going on without having to dig into anything and try to understand why you changed some stuff or didn't follow a traditional convention there. So we have our interface set up. This is what we're going to do. And obviously, this is subject to change. It's not, once you write it, it's concrete, right? This stuff can change over time. So we then want to go into our API, and I want to add, he's going to be a get, because that's how we're going to ask about him. I'm going to say pre And in this case, I don't actually need to do pre. The reason being is I'm not extending this route, right? Because it's a get, our traditional gets, posts, puts, patches, deletes for a user object can happen on the root. So API v1 user. And so if I want to, I don't have to even put him in as a template string. He can just be pre. So right on the user. Now we need to define our variable, right? This is the binding that we spoke about earlier. So I want to hit my bind method decorator. I'm going to add my method here for get. I have the request, the express request, again, kind of what we talked about. We make sure we put our TypeScript on there. We have our generics here, and this is API user request get that we just added, and then we have our response, and this is our RS response. Again, same thing, API user response get. We put in our body. We're going to say, user details. This is going to be of type API user response get, and then we're going to call off to our user service. So say this.userService.get by ID, as we want to follow clean coding to be a little bit more explicit, right? We could just say get, but you can get a user by a whole bunch of stuff. So having explicitly what we're getting is great. So we request.data.id, and that should be all that we need to get our user. As this isn't a multi-tenant setup, we don't have to worry about other companies. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff. We can just get the user by the ID. And then we're going to send our response wrapped in data, our kind of traditional send there. And then I just want to make this method. So kind of a nice thing in PHP Storm is I can just highlight it. I can do an alt, enter, execute on that first one, and it creates my method for me with my type, which is really nice. I want to give it my return type, so what I'm actually going to give it back here. We wrap it in a promise because we are returning technically a promise here. And he's going to be the get. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is you can see that we start our function or our class method off with async in the login. Right? The reason we do this is because we are making this request, this asynchronous request to the user table, getting the data back inside of this scope still, and then acting on that. So we do this match comparison and everything, right? So we need to wait for that promise to resolve in this case so we can use it. In the get by ID, we don't actually need to do that because I'm not using caching or anything like that. I'm not passing the data off to anything. I am just returning it, right? So in this case, I don't actually need to have this promise await the resolution and then hand back that another wrapped promise. I can just hand back the promise from the database. So we say user table, we want to get by ID. In this case, it's the user ID. Let's just change this as we're getting, we do have a little bit of a conflict here with our table. And this has some dependencies that we don't necessarily need. So we're going to just do the get by ID, and then, yeah, we'll kind of go from there. It looks like I don't need requester details actually, because it is an optional value here. So actually we should be okay there to just return from our table get by ID. Now I can use the method inside of table here, this generalized generic method, or I can override the method, and I'm going to override it just so you guys can see the full process. Inside of here, because the generic, because the table is set up with generics, I can put in my type here, so everything knows the types of the response and everything like that. So again, we just want to emphasize on TypeScript throughout the entirety of this. And you can see I cleaned up the parameters here, just so it's a little bit more explicit on what ID it is coming through. I know we're in the user service, so it should be self-explanatory, but you know, if we can have a little bit more explicitity, we want to. So now we have our get by ID from our API that talks to our service for a get by ID. Now I just want to make this into our database. I want to add a database function. Looks like that didn't want to copy over the way that I wanted, and it's probably because it inherits, but that's okay. We can go into database. I can go to the user table. We have our auth, we have our login with token methods that come on this guy. And then I want to say our get by ID is actually what we want. You can see he populated and set up with super, which again is perfectly fine to do, but I don't necessarily want to do that in this case because we just want to have this guy. We want to write the SQL ourselves in this case, where get by ID, the default is to return everything, right? We don't want everything, we want a subset. So I want to return, I'm going to say this.db. Now I have two options here. I can say query one or run query. I believe we covered this previously, but query one is, it says give me one result, and I expect one result, and if I don't get one result, I'm going to throw an error. So if it gets less, if it gets more, it's going to throw an error. It needs exactly one. Now the run query is just a nice wrapper around the MySQL query syntax that by default uses callbacks. So we can use async await on that. And it does the same thing. It returns an array of whatever object you select. So we're going to say query one because that's the one that I want. And then I'm just going to say select. We wanted ID, first name, last name, primary email. What else did we omit on that guy? Let's look at our interface. So we don't have token, permission, login, or password, which is okay. So no token, no permission, login, no password. So the only thing we're missing is created on. All right, so we're going to do that. Oh, geez. I do want to make this guy a template string, just so it's a little bit easier to manipulate my SQL. So we're going to set these guys up. I like to break these apart so they're just a little bit more readable, kind of what you would see from the console as well. And then we want to select that from user, where user.id is equal to that whatever's coming through with that object ID, or in this case I'm going to change him to user ID because I like the readability of that. The question mark is an optional placeholder, or it's the placeholder value that MySQL is going to escape whatever we're passing in and sanitize that for us, so we know that there's not going to be SQL injection on what this is. Obviously, because this is an ID, there's a very, very low probability of such, as we will set up our decoder here in a minute, our validator, that will sanitize that and ensure that it's good to go for us. But still, obviously, we don't want to just inject this into our template string. If it's coming from the front end, it could be malicious. If we just inject it right into the string, it's not going to be escaped. So we use that optional array value or options array value to ensure that MySQL is going to escape everything. So we can test this guy real quick. If we copy that, we can come over to our database. We can hit this guy and say we want to open the console. I can paste my query in and whatever my user ID is, user1. So I can say user1 and I can test my query. There we go. That's our query coming out of our database that we had up and running. So I know my query is going to work. It executes. That's my response that I expect. Everything should be great there. That's our get by ID. It's coming into the service, back to the API. Okay, so we can test this real fast. Turn on our debugger. In the meantime, we can go to wherever Postman went. I want to add a new request. He's going to be a get request. Get by ID. I'm going to say host, API v1 user. That is our user request. I don't need anything else because it's on the root. Because this is a get, we are using query parameters. So I can just say ID1. Let's see, it puts it into our query parameters. And I can fire my request. Cool, invalid token, which is great. That's kind of what we expect. We didn't make this guy public. Right, so this is our authentication layer throwing an error saying, hey, you don't have permission to talk to this thing. So I have a couple of options. I can make it public, so anybody can ask about any user, or I can go ahead and I can add my user token to our request. So what I want to do is I want to get my user token, and what the front end would do is it would get your user token from the authorization that takes place when you log in. So I'm going to get that user token. I want to go back to Postman. again, I can add this to my variables here. And I can say X API token, that's my value, and I'm going to save that guy. You might be wondering where I got X API token. Well, that comes from our middleware where we failed at in our authenticate, and we look at our X auth token, I guess. X auth token is what we want. So let's just update that. And now in our login, again, I can add it to the individual request, or I can add it to the whole section or the entirety of everything for my authorization. In this case, let's just add it to, we'll just do it to the individual request. It doesn't necessarily matter for this. It's an API key. We have our auth token. We have our value is auth token, and we want to add it to the header. So we save that guy, fire our request. Looks like we hit a breakpoint. Why that hit our login breakpoint, I'm not sure why. Because I fired the login request is why. That makes sense. There we go. Fire the actual get request, and there's our user object, right? That's our query that we had from the database with our parameters that came through. You can see everything. If we wanted to tweak any of this or change it, obviously we can, but there we go, right? And we have our get user. Now, one thing you're going to notice here as well, we have this output. We just have it set up as a warning, but it's saying you don't have any validation on this endpoint. So what I could technically do is I could send through IDs, and it's going to throw an error. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, the reason being is in our API, this is undefined. It doesn't exist, right? Data doesn't have an ID in this case. It has IDs, plural. So we could actually throw a breakpoint, and I'm going to just, one thing that happens on your server once in a while is on asynchronous calls, you actually, if you put a breakpoint on that line, you'll get the promise as opposed to hitting it before like you would think or want it to do. So I always just throw a console log in there, just simply to give myself a breakpoint to hit on. Otherwise, if it's in business logic or something, I could throw it on something that's on an asynchronous call, or I don't necessarily care about it. I just want it to halt before some execution. I can do that. But let's make sure our breakpoint is connected, right? We can fire this guy. We hit our breakpoint here. We can see that we have a request. Let's look at request. What does request have? Well, we want data, request data, and its IDs 1, right? So our request data ID, he doesn't exist. He's not a thing. If I were to evaluate this guy and I were to say request.data, you can see that, .id, he doesn't exist. He's undefined. So that's where our error is coming from, right? So we can play through that guy because we found the error. We know what it is. We know what's going wrong. And conveniently, we logged out that we don't have any validation. So let's go into our middleware, API validation, our validators, and we're going to go into the user validation. Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff here that handles the proper lookups and everything like that, and then does the test against your validation that you don't necessarily have to worry about. It's already set up and running. If you're curious, obviously you can go take a look at those. So the way that this is set up, though, it is the HTTP method, and then whatever the route happens to be off of the root. So you can see we have user login. Well, this is login. If you have a get on just the root, in our case, we don't have to actually put anything beyond that. So we just want to do a JSON decoder. Here's an object strict. Object strict. We always want to make sure we put the types on here. Otherwise, it's not going to do any sort of detection for us and help us out. So we want to do the request and we want to do the get request. So there's a couple of different options. There's the object or object strict. We almost exclusively want to use object strict, where that means you can't pass through anything else. You can only pass through the data that you have or that is set up in here. So in our login, if I tried to pass through anything other than username or password, it's going to fail and tell me that I can't do that. Our API isn't expecting anything beyond these two things. And you provided something beyond those two things, so therefore you're not using the API the way that it's defined, documented, and intended. So we want to set up object strict. We know that it's the ID, and again, it will handle it. It'll help us for, you'll get your IntelliSense on there as well. And he's going to be a number. So our JSON decoder, he expects it to be a number value, and we need to just give it our second parameter here into the JSON decoder stuff. So I always tend to put it this way, as the HTTP method, and then whatever the route to that method happens to be, from whatever the file is on. So now we have our get that's set up. We can restart our server. That is one thing to keep in mind. You make server changes, you got to restart your server. I don't like nodemon. Some people do. It always kind of drives me crazy. So you can set that up if you want to, but yeah. Anyway, okay, so now we have our authorization. We have our parameters. He's still expecting ID. We pass through IDs, and you can see our object strict in play, right? We found something on this route. We don't know what it is, and we don't expect it. We're not going to let you proceed into the API, into our routes. So if I change that to what I do actually expect with our IDs, or our ID single, I can fire that guy through. I get a request. You can see I get past it, and no more errors here. So we are good to go. We are happy, and we are set up. So that is really it. A few things to note is in our tables in our database here, we absolutely do not use any ORMs. We write the SQL ourselves. If you need help with SQL, obviously ask your team leader seniors on your projects. Anyway, that should be about it for this on the initial walkthrough. And it'll be very similar to what you're going to be expected to do on the kind of red sky version of going through stuff for your onboarding. So, okay, thank you.